My Flexible Learning Institute project involved completely redesigning the microscopy-based subjects I teach. So I teach histology and histopathology to our medical science and biotechnology students. And traditionally, the way those subjects are taught involves the students being in the laboratory at a microscope. The learning outcomes related to this particular resource really were the diagnosis and identification of a whole series of different diseases. And so the students had to understand, what the disease was and what it looks like under the microscope. My own teaching philosophy, I guess, relates around lifelong learning and the ability to go and seek information and interpret that information. In the real world, we all know that we have access to all sorts of information. It's very different to sitting in an exam room. So what I'd like the students to be able to do is to go and find all the information that can help support them in making their diagnosis or whatever it might actually be, and really justify their decisions. In the past, they were absolutely limited to sitting in a laboratory at a microscope with a glass slide. That was the only space they could engage with this material. It really was. Unfortunately, the distance education students only attend a residential school for 4 days, and they have to complete a lot of assessment in that very short time frame. The students were inadequately prepared when they arrived at the residential school, and then they were under a lot of pressure whilst they were here. The other thing about residential schools is that they are positioned right in the middle, or generally quite early in the session, and they haven't studied the theory material. So we're asking them to complete activities that they haven't even yet covered in the subject. So it's very difficult for them to ask really good, solid questions on topics that they haven't even studied yet. It's a very short time frame that you have to engage with these students, and it's actually very difficult to assist a student when they're looking down a microscope, because you actually don't know what they're physically looking at. So you can sit there and say, yes, the cell's at 12 o'clock, yes, the cell's at 3 o'clock, but are you truly examining the same thing? So what I did in my project was use a combination of virtual microscopy. So what we do is basically digitally reproduce the microscope slides. So as opposed to sitting at a microscope in the laboratory, they received on a series of DVDs the virtual slides. Along with the virtual slides came a lot of other learning resources that were embedded within the Interact, or the learning management system that CSU has. So there were YouTube clips embedded, additional readings, links to the textbook, activities on the textbook website. The key for me was truly integrating all of the resources for the subject. To make the resource truly beneficial for my distance education students, I had to combine that with some real-time interaction with my students, and that was where the combination with the virtual online classroom came into the project. The student had to study the theory material, so read through the textbook, look at all the additional resources. Then they had to look at their virtual slide, and they had to come up with a diagnosis for themselves on what they thought the disease was in that particular case. Then we got together as a group in the online virtual classroom, so in real time, where the students can actually interact with me and also with their class members. And basically I asked them at the start of the tutorial, what is your tentative diagnosis? Now that's actually really helpful, because if they haven't got it right, I actually know the mistakes they've made up front, and so then I can say, okay, so you didn't diagnose it as cervical cancer, you just diagnosed it as cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, or whatever it might actually be. And I can say, look, that's why, I can see why you thought it might have been that, but this is the reason why it is actually this. It's a really nice way to see where the students might have made some errors and discuss those in the tutorial. So then we basically had the session together, interactive session, so the students were involved in drawing all over the slides and answering interactive questions. And then they had to then go away and write up the case study as a formal report that was submitted as an assessment item. So the resource was integral to the learning activities, but also integral to the assessment in the subject. For my project, certainly creating that virtual microscope resource, designing learning activities and assessment items around that resource, and then actually interacting with the students in real time was really important. The feedback from students was that they really appreciated being forced to use that technology. The workforce is and does require you to certainly engage with technologies, and I think they really appreciated having the opportunities to do that in these subjects. I must admit, when I started my project, I had the intention of really enhancing my subjects for distance education students. That was my real focus. One of the side benefits, I guess, was that it really enhanced the learning outcomes for on-campus or internal students as well. I guess the underpinning strategies to what I developed and what I used was really almost practice-based learning. So that is actually what they would receive in the workplace. So, and people traditionally might have had some issues with the use of virtual microscopy because they say, our scientists need to know how to use a microscope, and I couldn't agree more. But these students are third year, final year students. They will have come to residential schools for 5 years because they do the course part-time. So the microscopy skills, I'm pretty confident, are very well developed at this point. The use of the technologies and basically getting the students to use a method that perhaps isn't mainstream at the moment in a laboratory, but is certainly used for programs like external quality assurance programs. So our QAPs all come in on virtual slides. So to expose them to things that are used in practice and will be more and more important in terms of laboratory practice. Look, I think I would be confident enough to say that I think all of the types of interactions, so between learner academic, learner and learner resources, were enhanced with this resource, and that was something that was really great to see. By being able to interact with the students on a week-by-week basis, so they get to study the material, then they get to ask me any questions that they have, and I think that really enhanced the interactions between myself and the student. They were asking much better questions. They really did engage with the resource, and it was really nice to see, particularly because I see the on-campus students, to see them all talking with each other, going, what do you think this week's case study is? So they really did interact with the resource and with each other. There's always a couple of students out of any class that will not want to engage at all, and that was a challenge, I think, and it was only probably 1 or 2 students out of 40 in the class that really would prefer to sit by themselves and actually not interact with other students. Now, I completely supported my strategy to almost force that interaction because, once again, in the real world, when you're working in a laboratory, you can't work in isolation. So I think almost forcing that interaction through the use of the ICTs was an advantage. The students, in terms of the spaces they could use, they had any kind of endless opportunities, I guess, to interact with the resource. What this project enabled me to do was to create more spaces for these students to interact with this material. What they can do is, they might take their laptop and decide to sit out in the park, and that's where they really feel that they get the most out of sitting down and engaging with the resource. Or they actually can sit there and a couple of students can view the slides together. They can actually work on the slides together. At a microscope, there's only 2 eyes. the online virtual classroom, that was a new space for everyone, and it was really nice to see a lot of development throughout the session in the way the students interacted in that space. Particularly the comments or the feedback from the internal students was they actually almost preferred being slightly more anonymous in an online environment. So the perhaps classically shy student would have the guts to ask a question because, you know, they don't have to put up their hand and actually speak out loud. They could actually just type a question in and ask it that way. In terms of the literacies associated with this resource and the literacies developed with this resource, I remember specifically a feedback comment I had from a student from the survey that was sent out, and it said something like, "Hats off to Lucy for forcing us to engage with this technology," because there are students, and even I'm constantly surprised how many first year on-campus students, we assume they are technologically literate, but they're sometimes not, and you cannot make those sorts of assumptions. Lots of lessons learned, I think. The first lesson, I guess, is when launching into a project like this, you really have to consider the type of IT support you actually have. If a subject is, as mine was, very heavily reliant in terms of using a technology for its teaching, what is your backup plan if that technology does actually fail? Oh, lots of positive things out of the project, and that is the interaction between the students, the way the students really do appreciate the effort that goes into the design and implementation of these resources, and the real advantages of creating such flexible resources. The students don't want to send them back. That's the only issue I had. I come from a very traditional research background. My background's in breast cancer research. So when I worked at another institution, I was employed as a research-only academic. For me, the move to CSU, the first 3 years of teaching has been the steepest learning curve that I've ever been on. And I'm certain that learning curve's probably going to stay just as steep for a while. But what I can say is that I would love to see the technology and the resource that I've developed rolled out to other subjects in our own course for starters, because the students are certainly starting to request that, and I think that's something that I would like to do to support other members of our faculty in implementing this sort of resource, but also to look outside the university. So when I started this project, there was no one at CSU that I really looked for support or collaboration, just because certainly in my own school I'm the only person that teaches in this area. So I've engaged with a number of people, for example at the University of New South Wales, the University of Western Australia, to work with, and so we're putting in some ALTC grants and the like to actually work together on developing some different types of resources, so moving away from the virtual microscopy, looking at 3D animations and that sort of work. So I guess I would like to keep moving along with the scholarship of learning and teaching in line with my discipline-specific research that I'll certainly continue as well. But it certainly opened up a whole area that I didn't anticipate I would engage with when I started working here.